We are back again with On the Moneyline, a podcast by MMAPlay365. I'm your host Newsome, and we're here again at the Apex in Vegas for UFC Vegas 19. We currently have 15 fights on this card, but I think the UFC are just overcompensating due to the amount of fights that are getting cancelled every week, so it definitely makes sense for sure. But this card is built around the second fight night in a row that has a heavyweight main event, as Curtis Razor Blaydes will meet Derrick the Black Beast Lewis. Blaydes is one of my favourite fighters for years now, and Lewis is absolutely hilarious, along with having probably top 3 punching power in the UFC, so it's really hard not to like him either. This is a great fight and a main event that I'm really looking forward to. But just before we get into the breakdowns, as always, there's a few things to mention in regards to MMAPlay365. We are coming off a decent week of results after UFC 258. Kelvin Gastelum was the only official bet that we could have cashed on that night, and he really gave a veteran lesson in that fight too. We got a good betting line on Gastelum, and it should have been wider. We also had Kamaru Usman parlayed with a fighter on this event, which that bet is now down to a single if you like, as Usman knocked out Gilbert Burns. I felt a little hard done by with the free dog of the week, which was Phil Rowe. It was a close fight, granted, but I thought he'd done enough to get the win. And remember, we have multiple packages on the MMAPlay365 website for all the UFC betting advice you'll ever need. We have various subscription lengths and options too, so to see our full service list, please go and visit MMAPlay365.com for more information or to sign up today. And let's break down some fights in the main event. We've got Curtis Blaydes versus Derrick Lewis. Curtis Blaydes is currently the minus 400 favourite, the comeback on Lewis at plus 325 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think you've got some marginal value still on Curtis Blaydes at minus 400. I think when you are talking value side, although Derrick Lewis has absolutely got a path to victory, which we'll get into soon, I do feel that there is more value on Blaydes at minus 400 than there is on Derrick Lewis at plus 325, even though that is a big number. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think that Curtis Blaydes is going to get bet on still at minus 400. It wouldn't shock me to see him go to minus 450, even closer to minus 500. I think he's going to be in a lot of people's parlays, which makes sense. So, as I say every single week, that parlay money does matter and it does move the betting line. So, I think Curtis Blaydes is going to enter the fight on Saturday night around minus 450. As for how this fight plays out though, breaking it down and analysing it, it's one of the more simple fights in my opinion. You've got Curtis Blaydes, who is absolutely the best offensive wrestler in the UFC heavyweight division. There's an argument that he's the best offensive wrestler in the UFC, period. So he is a fighter that will go out there. He won't change his game plan. He knows what he wants to do. His opponents know what he wants to do. And even when he's striking, he'll be making reads on how to enter into a takedown safely so he doesn't get caught and he doesn't get knocked out. That's just who Curtis Blaydes is, and he'll rack up as many takedowns as he needs to make sure that he wins that fight or gives himself the best chance of finishing the fight on the mat. And ultimately, this is where Derrick Lewis is going to have huge problems, because Blaydes is this beast wrestler and Derrick Lewis is a fighter that has actually got really poor takedown defense, and he's got poor takedown defense for 2 reasons. Firstly, his movement on the feet outside of his explosive bursts, which I will talk about very shortly. His movement is very static. He's flat-footed, he plods forward, his hips can be quite squared off at times as well, and that just allows any fighter that wants to take him down to be able to get him down with relative ease. And the second reason why his takedown defense is poor is because he just doesn't try to defend the takedown. Once his opponent is on his hips and they've shot in, if that's a decent entry, then he's likely going to go down. And this is backed up when you look at his previous fights as well. Alexey Oleinik took him down. Ilia Latifi took him down 3 times. Ivanov took him down 3 times. Daniel Cormier took him down 4 times. Volkov took him down once. Marcin Tybura took him down once. Shamil Abdurakhimov took him down 4 times. Roy Nelson took him down 7 times. Victor Pesta took him down 5 times. You know, you could go on, but the proof is there that Derrick Lewis's takedown defense just isn't good, and it doesn't fare well for him in this fight. However, Derrick Lewis does have that trump card. In my opinion, behind Francis Ngannou, he is the hardest puncher in the UFC. I feel that no matter what happens in Derrick Lewis fights, he could be losing the entire fight like he did against Volkov, and then in the last 10 seconds just land one big hard punch that knocks his opponent out. He has that big fight ending one bomb power, and that's definitely a concern if you're Curtis Blaydes or if you're any opponent of Derrick Lewis, because Blaydes could be doing well for the entire fight, he could be doing well for 4 rounds taking him down, but if Derrick Lewis just lands one punch, it's over. That's his trump card. But the thing is with Curtis Blaydes, and the reason why I feel stylistically he should be okay here, is because he's going to be wanting to close the distance at all times. He's going to want to be close to Derrick Lewis. The closer he gets to Derrick Lewis, the less likely it is that Lewis is going to land that big punch, because that big punch needs to be landed in boxing range. So if Curtis Blaydes is closing the distance through boxing range, clinching up with Lewis, then he's not going to be as liable to get knocked out. And it's the same with if he takes Lewis down constantly as well. If he keeps getting Lewis down, if he's on top, then that knockout punch just isn't going to happen with Lewis on bottom. And the other side to this is Curtis Blaydes actually has one of the best chins in the UFC. We've seen him eat a bomb from Mark Hunt, which not many fighters can take. We've seen him eat a clean, hard knee from Alistair Overeem, which not many fighters can take. Yes, he did get TKO'd against Francis Ngannou the second time those guys fought, but when Ngannou cracked him, Blaydes didn't go out unconscious. He was still moving, he was still aware of what was going on, but unfortunately it was just a little bit too much for Blaydes in that particular fight. So Blaydes has got a really good chin, he's got really good recoverability as well. I'm not saying Lewis can't knock him out, because I do think if Lewis hits him clean 2 or 3 times really hard, then that could either knock Blaydes out or start the finish off, which is what happened in the Ngannou fight. But for me, I feel that the durability of Blaydes, his recoverability, and along with his style in regards to being relentless with his wrestling, I do think it makes that big knockout from Derrick Lewis a little less probable. So for those reasons, I'm picking Curtis Blaydes to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Ketlen Vieira versus Yana Kunitskaya. Ketlen Vieira is currently the -265 favourite. The comeback on Kunitskaya at +225 is the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I don't see too much value if I'm being honest. I feel that the betting line's fair. I understand why Ketlen Vieira is quite a big favourite in this fight. And although I don't think it's going to be easy for Vieira, I do think that stylistically this is a good fight for her. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think that the betting line on Ketlen Vieira is going to hit that brick wall at some point. It might be -275, it might be -280, but at some point I do feel that it's just going to be too wide and people will start taking that underdog shot on Kunitskaya. And I'd understand at that point if Kunitskaya was +250, +260, then I definitely understand that shot on her. So I think when these two ladies step into the cage on fight night, that the betting line is going to be not too far off where we're sitting right about now. And as for how this fight plays out, as I've already mentioned, I do think stylistically it does favour Vieira. And the reason for that is you look at how Kunitskaya wins fights. Obviously she's got this karate striking background, but that's not how she's winning the majority of the fights in the UFC. She's winning fights by closing the distance, clinching up, pushing her opponents back against the cage, using short punches and elbows in close. She's quite dominant in the clinch. But the thing is, against Vieira, by closing that distance and clinching up with her, you're actually playing into her game plan. So what Vieira's going to want to do herself is close the distance, clinch up. She's quite physical and strong herself, and I do think that physicality is going to be greater than the physicality of Kunitskaya, which is really important in this fight, especially if we do get a lot of clinch scenarios against the cage. So Vieira will want to close that distance, she will want to tie up, she will want to push Kunitskaya against the cage, and from there she can start working a judo, looking for trips, looking to throw Kunitskaya to the mat and getting on top so she can work a jiu-jitsu. Ketlen Vieira's top game is very heavy. She is a very dangerous fighter to have on top of you, and once she starts working on the mat, she can look really good. She can get a ground and pound going. Whilst the ground and pound's going, she'll be looking for submission opportunities. If submission opportunities don't make themselves apparent, then she will just ride out on top, waste minutes on the clock, win those rounds, and ultimately try and win the fight that way. So I think for Kunitskaya, she's got to come into this fight with a slightly different game plan, a different game plan than what she normally brings inside the cage, and that would be to strike with Vieira, not get close to her, not try and clinch up with her, try and stay on the outside. But actually I don't think that's going to be that easy either, because Vieira's not a bad striker herself. I do think technically Kunitskaya is the better striker, striker, but as I said, it is really close, and Vieira is definitely no slouch on the feet either. She can definitely box, and she boxes to close the distance as well, which is obviously, as I've mentioned, her greatest path to victory in this fight. So I don't think it's an easy fight for Kunitskaya. I think A, she's going to be fighting a game plan that she's not used to fighting, and B, I think that the aggression and forward pressure of Vieira will allow her game plan to kick in this fight, and her game plan to be the dominant game plan. So I think Vieira's going to have her way in this fight. I don't think it's going to be a whitewash. I do think Kunitskaya is going to have her moments, but overall, I think that Vieira has more chance of finishing this fight, and if it goes to a decision, I just see her winning at least 2 out of the 3 rounds. So I'm picking Ketlen Vieira to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a fun one here between Darrick Minner and Charles Rosa. Charles Rosa is currently the -190 favourite. The comeback on Minner at +165 as the underdog. As for where the value is in this fight, I don't see too much value. Again, I think the line's relatively fair, and even at -190, that finishing ability, which I will talk about soon, of Darrick Minner, is definitely dangerous and can cash that dog ticket. So I do think Rosa's the rightful favourite, but at -190, I do have a few concerns as well. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think the line is going to fluctuate. I do think we are going to see Darrick Minner money coming in, which it is a little bit at the minute, but again, I do think it's only going to go so low before people start betting Charles Rosa, because when you look at Charles Rosa as an overall fighter, he is the better fighter. And again, I'll touch upon this soon, but I think it's going to fluctuate. Ultimately, when we get there on Saturday night, I think both fighters are going to step into the cage roughly where they're at right about now. As for how the fight plays out though, I've already touched upon a couple of things. The first thing that I touched upon was that finishing ability of Darrick Minner. He is an absolute nightmare early in fights with his grappling, with his submission attempts, especially that guillotine. We saw it last time out against TJ Laramie, which honestly I did not see Laramie throwing his head into that guillotine, but he did. And when you give Darrick Minner your neck, he's going to take it and he's going to submit you. It doesn't matter who you are. But the problem is with Darrick Minner is he puts so much energy into those early moments in the fights. He barely lasts longer than 1.5 rounds in regards to his gas tank and his cardio before he's completely drained, before it's completely empty, and then his opponents can do pretty much whatever they want to do to him because he's that badly tired. But Minner does have the ability to win a round 1 and win a round 2, and if he can survive round 3, then he's obviously won the fight 29-28. The thing is, when you look at Charles Rosa, you'll look at the last opponent that he faced that has got similar skills and qualities to Darrick Minner, which is Bryce Mitchell. And again, that's a little bit off because Bryce Mitchell's an absolute machine. You know, he's completely levels above Darrick Minner, but Bryce Mitchell is also a fighter that goes out there, starts fast, gets his grappling game going, and really looks to put his grappling and submission attempts on his opponents early in fights. So although Charles Rosa got absolutely demolished by Bryce Mitchell, as I've already mentioned, there's levels in this game, and Bryce Mitchell is absolute levels above Darrick Minner. Now, I'm not saying Darrick Minner won't have some success early on. In fact, I think he will against Charles Rosa. Rosa's got to be really careful in those early moments, but I don't think that Rosa is going to get ran through by Minner like he got ran through by Bryce Mitchell. Charles Rosa's a legit Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt himself, and that's really important. I think that's going to keep him safe early in this fight. I do think Minner's going to have those early moments, but I don't think Minner is going to get Rosa out of there. I think Rosa and his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu qualities is going to keep him safe for the majority of those moments, and I do think that Minner's gas tank will empty at some point midway through round 2 that'll allow Rosa to really kick on and take over the fight. And I think that once Rosa does take over this fight, it's going to look very easy and very one-sided. I think he's going to win round 2. I'd be shocked if he didn't win round 3, but I think that he does enough to win on the judges' scorecards if it goes there for sure, especially with the better body of work at the latter stages of round 2. But I also feel that he's got a very high chance of finishing Darrick Minner late in this fight as well, especially if Minner's gas tank is really depleted that badly. So the fact that I feel Rosa's the more likely fighter to win a decision, the fact that I feel he's going to have the greater finishing ability later in the fight, I do think he's going to have to weather a storm, but I'm picking Charles Rosa to win this fight. And in the next fight in the heavyweight division, we've got Alexey Oleinik versus Chris Daukaus. Chris Daukaus is currently the -170 favourite. The comeback on Oleinik at +150 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the value sits with Alexey Oleinik at plus 150. I do understand why Chris Daukaus is a favourite, but I think he's too big of a favourite in this spot. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think that the betting line's going to close up, if I'm being honest. I don't think it's going to get close to a pick'em, but I definitely think that we'll see plenty of money coming in on Oleinik, and he might enter the cage on Saturday night plus 120, plus 125. As for how the fight plays out though, although Chris Daukaus can grapple, I definitely think it's a striker versus grappler type of fight. I think Chris Daukaus' best path to victory is to knock Oleinik out, and Oleinik's best path to victory is to take Daukaus down and submit him. So I do feel it's striker versus grappler. And actually, when you look at the paths to victory for each fighter, both paths are really solid, because you've got Daukaus, who has really good movement on the feet for a heavyweight. He's got really fast hands, good boxing. He's got power in his hands as well, throws in combinations. And it's these types of fighters and strikers that Oleinik has real problems with, because Daukaus is absolutely going to be faster than Oleinik. His movement's going to be better than Oleinik's, and he's going to be able to land on Oleinik for as long as this fight stays on the feet. But then we flip over to Oleinik. Oleinik, he'll walk forward, he'll look to throw big bombs, and he won't throw the bombs to try and knock his opponent out. If he does, then great, he can crack hard. But it's really just to push his opponents back so he can close that distance, shoot a takedown and get the fight on the mat. And on the mat, even though Daukaus can grapple, as I've already mentioned, the gap in skill here is astronomical. Alexey Oleinik is an absolute wizard on the mat. He uses really unorthodox submissions like the scarf hold neck crank, like the Ezekiel choke, where he can get these submissions from all kinds of different positions as well. He's really difficult to deal with on the mat, and I feel that Oleinik's experience in the UFC, the level of competition that he's been fighting, is also far greater than the competition that Chris Daukaus has faced outside of the UFC and is currently faced inside the UFC as well. So for me, I feel that Oleinik has not only fought the better competition, but he's beaten better fighters than Daukaus as well. Now, there's every chance here that Daukaus comes in early in this fight, gets his movement going, gets his hands going, starts landing combinations on Oleinik, drops him and puts him out. That is absolutely a possibility, but I do think that Oleinik can weather that early storm. I do think once that early storm has been weathered, not that Daukaus is going to get tired, but it will allow Oleinik to start moving forward himself. He'll be able to get a hold of Daukaus and get him down to the mat. I think if he does get Daukaus down to the mat with a couple of minutes to work, I do think that he will find a submission. I think the paths to victory are great on either side. I just think the UFC veteran experience, the level of competition that Oleinik's faced, and that enormous gap in skill on the mat in the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is enough for Oleinik to get the job done in this fight. So I'm picking Alexey Oleinik to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a fight that's been rebooked. We've got Nassourdine Imavov versus Phil Hawes. Phil Hawes is currently the minus 125 favourite. The comeback on Imavov at plus 105 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, as I said in the last breakdown, I feel that the value is with the underdog in Imavov. I don't think there's as much value at plus 105 as what it was when they were scheduled to fight before. I think Imavov was plus 125, plus 130, if I remember correctly. There was definitely more value there, but at plus 105, that plus money, I do feel that Imavov is the value side here. And as for where the betting line moves, this has been fluctuating a little bit. Only a couple of days ago it was a pick'em. Now some good money's coming in on Hawes, pushed him out to a minus 125 favourite, and Imavov into plus money. I can see money coming in on Imavov now as well. It maybe push it back to closer to a pick'em, and I think a pick'em is probably where both fighters are going to be at when they step in the cage on Saturday night. And as for how this fight plays out, I've already broken this fight down once on the previous podcast when these two were scheduled, and I still have the same thoughts again here too. I think in regards to early on in this fight, Phil Hawes is going to be extremely dangerous. He comes out fast, hard, explosive, wings bombs, big knockout power, good wrestling as well, explosive into the takedowns, good double legs, good single legs. He's able to get fights down to the mat if he needs to, but like I say, on the feet, he will throw bombs as well. Coming off a big knockout win, it wouldn't surprise me if he tried to continue that trend and get Imavov out of there early. The problem with Hawes though is his gas tank and his cardio doesn't work well with his fighting style. And what I mean by that is when he's coming out hard and fast and he's throwing these big bombs and looking to explode into takedown entries and get his opponents down, and if his opponents are standing back up to the feet and he's having to hit mat returns, this style of fighting just expends so much of your gas tank. It's really harsh on the cardio, and Hawes doesn't have the best cardio, so that's my problem here. I feel that if Imavov can weather that early storm, he might get taken down a couple of times, he might get hit hard a couple of times as well, but Imavov has shown an ability to be able to get back up to his feet. He's shown an ability to get hurt and recover in fights. I'm not saying that he can't get knocked out, but I feel that he's got a style that can weather a storm, and if he does weather that early storm in the first round, I honestly don't think Phil Hawes is going to be the same in round 2 and definitely not in round 3, and that's when Imavov can start getting his own game going. He can start getting his strikes put together, he can start putting combinations together, he can start putting volume on Hawes, he can potentially even start clinching up with Hawes and even take Hawes down as well. If Hawes is tired, I think Imavov's going to be able to get takedowns, so really it all depends on what happens in that round 1. Either Phil Hawes comes into this fight and he gets Imavov out of there in round 1, or Imavov survives round 1, starts taking over the fight from round 2, takes round 3 as well. He might even find a finish in those final 2 rounds if Hawes is tired as well. If he doesn't find a finish and he just wins round 2 and 3, then he's going to win on the scorecards there. I'm going to go with the latter scenario. I think Imavov does weather the storm. In rounds 2 and 3, there's definitely a chance that he can finish Hawes. If he doesn't and he just wins those rounds, then he's going to win the fight 29-28. So I'm going to pick Nassourdine Imavov to win this fight. And in the next fight, another good fight in the heavyweight division, we've got Andrei Arlovski versus Tom Aspinall. Tom Aspinall is currently the minus 245 favourite. The comeback on Arlovski at plus 205 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think there's some value in Tom Aspinall at minus 245. I understand that Arlovski is dangerous at that plus 205 betting line, and he's done it time and time again against fighters that the bookies have thought should go in there and absolutely run through Arlovski, and he's been able to slow a fight down, fight at his pace, and ultimately cash that big dog ticket. But Tom Aspinall, I feel, is just a different beast. I think he's a good prospect in the UFC and he puts things together really well. I'll touch upon this shortly, but when Aspinall was minus 300 here, I would have been singing a different tune, but at minus 245, I do think that he's the value side. As for where this betting line moves throughout fight week, obviously that current trend is the money on Arlovski, and I do get it at minus 300 for Aspinall. That was way too wide, so people have been backing the dog in Arlovski, and I do expect that to continue throughout fight week as well. I think Aspinall's going to come into this fight minus 200, maybe minus 205, minus 210. I think he's going to be in that region come Saturday night. And as for how this fight plays out, Arlovski's a really difficult fight for any fighter outside of that top 10, top 15, because he's a veteran and he can weather a storm to a certain extent, but what truly makes him difficult to beat for these up and coming fighters is he can slow a fight down to his own pace. He can dictate the pace of the fight and just basically fight how he wants to fight and make the fight go how he wants a fight to go. We've seen it time and time again, him coming up against these really explosive fighters that move well and that like to be aggressive and push forward, but as soon as they get in the cage with Arlovski, it's almost like they freeze, and once that happens, Arlovski can then start feeling his way into the fight. He slows that fight right down. He makes the fight really ugly, really close, to the point where if it goes to the judges' scorecards, nobody really knows which way the fight is going to go and who's actually won that fight, just because the fight was that close. But the thing is with Tom Aspinall, I don't think that we're going to see that from him. He's not the type of fighter to really be fazed by what's in front of him. He's a type of fighter that's really young. He's had a lot of hype on him leading up into the UFC. He's had good wins in the UFC now as well, and I just feel that that hype that's on him and that confidence he's got, it's going to make him come at Arlovski. It's not going to make him look over at the opposite side of the cage and see an MMA legend and a UFC veteran that he's starstruck by. Tom Aspinall doesn't strike me as the type of fighter that's going to have that sort of effect in the cage. I think Aspinall's going to come at Arlovski. He might take a minute or 2 2 minutes just to figure Arlovski out and see what he's got to give. But once Aspinall starts letting his hands go, his hands are really fast, his boxing's really sharp, he hits really hard, his movement's good as well. And although I think Arlovski's going to have moments in this fight, I don't think those moments are going to result in a KO. And that's important, because if he doesn't KO Aspinall, I think over 15 minutes, Aspinall could potentially knock Arlovski out. He could potentially take Arlovski down and use his jiu-jitsu. And that's the thing with Aspinall. His base in MMA is Brazilian jiu-jitsu. You know, he's turned and developed himself into a striker over the years, and he's become a really good striker, especially with the boxing. So Aspinall could even knock Arlovski out over 15 minutes, or he could take him down, score points on the mat, or he could just outpoint him, outvolume him over 15 minutes. I think the volume is going to be greater on Aspinall's side. So if Arlovski doesn't get that KO against Aspinall, I do think it's going to be a difficult fight for Arlovski to win. I think there's more paths to victory for Aspinall. I think his ceiling is super high. I think his development from fight to fight is going to be really great as well. And again, I think he's a good prospect and one to watch out for in the future. I do think he passes this veteran test, and I'm picking Tom Aspinall to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a good one here. We've got Jared Gordon versus Danny Chavez. Danny Chavez is currently the -140 favourite. The comeback on Gordon at +120 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think there's marginal value on Danny Chavez. He does seem to have a lot of money coming in on him at the minute, and I think if he pushes out to -150, -160, then the value will slip for sure. But at -140, I do feel there is marginal value on Chavez. As for how the betting line moves throughout fight week, I think it's going to fluctuate, but I can only imagine that money is going to come in on Jared Gordon. He is a decent fighter. He is a fighter that will grind out decisions, and he's a popular fighter as well. So I think money will come on Gordon throughout fight week. When both fighters step into the cage on Saturday night, I do expect Chavez to be a favourite, but I do think he's only going to be a very slight favourite. As for how this fight plays out though, it's a really good fight, and I think we're going to see some really explosive exchanges on the feet. Danny Chavez is a fighter that doesn't really waste strikes. Everything's calculated. He puts combinations together really well. He doesn't apply a lot of volume in his fights, but when he does burst forward, he's accurate and he hits hard. And Jared Gordon likes to get into these punching exchanges as well, and that's where I feel that it's quite a dangerous fight for Gordon, because if Gordon's getting into these firefights with Chavez, I think inside boxing range, Chavez's punches are crisper, he hits harder, and he hits in more volume inside that boxing range in regards to the combination. So I think Gordon could potentially get hurt if he exchanges too much with Chavez. Gordon's got to get his wrestling going and his grappling topside, but that's where I think he's going to have difficulties, because Danny Chavez in his UFC debut against TJ Brown, who's a good wrestler himself, Brown struggled to get him down. 6 attempts, all defended by Chavez. Good fundamentals in defending the takedowns, and Chavez actually took Brown down 4 times. So Chavez's wrestling is decent and he is difficult to take down. I do think Gordon will have some success here though. I think Gordon's a better wrestler with better takedowns than TJ Brown, and he's definitely got a better top game than TJ Brown as well. So Gordon certainly has paths to victory here, but I don't think that Gordon can score the takedowns and spend the amount of time on top that he needs to win the rounds here. I feel like the bigger moments and the bigger actions in this fight are going to be on the feet, with Chavez landing really hard strikes and looking to finish the fight. That's what the judges like to see. They like to see a fighter finishing the fight and landing hard strikes. So if this does go to a decision, I definitely think the wrestling could be a bit of a factor in this fight from Gordon's perspective, but I do think the bigger moments and the bigger actions are going to be on the feet. And so if that's the case, then I do think Chavez has the better chance of winning a decision. And if he is landing hard on Gordon, I do have some question marks over the durability of Gordon. So I think that Chavez is live for a finish. I do think he's live to win a decision. I also think Gordon's live to win a decision as well. It's just I think that Chavez will put in the better body of work over 15 minutes should it hit the scorecard. So for those reasons, I'm picking Danny Chavez to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Drakkar Klose versus Luis Violent Bob Ross Pena. Drakkar Klose is currently the -190 favourite. The comeback on Pena at +165 is the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I definitely think the value sits with the underdog in Pena. I absolutely understand that Drakkar Klose is the favourite. and he's rightfully favoured as well. It's just I think he's favoured a little bit too much. The line's a little bit too wide here. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think that we are going to see money coming in on Pena. That seems to be the current trend. Drakkar Klose was minus 200, minus 220 just a couple of days ago. So money has come in on Pena. I think that continues to happen. I think the betting line will shorten a bit, and I think we'll see Drakkar Klose coming into this fight at around minus 165, maybe even minus 170. As for how the fight plays out, as I've mentioned, I do understand why Drakkar Klose is the favourite, and that's purely because he's a gritty, grinding type of fighter that he's good wherever the fight goes. His striking's decent, his wrestling's decent, his jiu-jitsu's decent. And then when you look over at Luis Pena, he's been a little underwhelming so far in the UFC. He has had some good moments, but for the most part, he has, in my opinion, underperformed. He has been a little underwhelming, and he's been a little flaky at times as well. Like in his last fight, he was 1-1 going into that third round with Karmawervi, and he shot in for a takedown and got guillotined. And it's performances like that really leave you asking questions about how good Pena actually is and how far he can go, because when he first came into the UFC, he looked like he had all the skills and all the abilities to really go far, but we just haven't seen that yet. And it's in this type of fight against somebody like Drakkar Klose that he is going to have struggles and problems with throughout the fight. I do think Pena will have moments. I do think that he's going to be the better striker on the outside. I definitely think that he's going to be able to catch Klose with some nice strikes, and he might even take a round. But if this gets into a fight where Drakkar Klose is just getting hit on too much from the outside because there's a big height and a big reach advantage for Luis Pena, then Klose is just going to close the distance, get in tight, clinch up with Pena, and look to start either grinding on him on the cage, which he's done in previous fights, or he'll take him down and start working his jiu-jitsu. The one thing I will say with Klose, and this is a red flag for him, is that he's no longer with Fight Ready Eddie Char. He's moved on from there. Something happened in that camp, in that gym, that Drakkar Klose didn't like, and he's gone elsewhere. That is a bit of a worry because Eddie Char is a phenomenal coach. Fight Ready is a really good gym as well, but obviously something's happened that Drakkar Klose didn't like or agree with, and he's gone elsewhere. So there is a possibility, there is a chance that that does have an effect on Klose. It might make him better, it might make him underperform, we don't know, but it's just a concern. Aside from that, I do think it's a good fight for Drakkar Klose. I do think if this fight goes the distance, which again is a high likelihood that it is going to go the distance, I think that Klose can definitely take 2 out of those 3 rounds, if not all 3. I still don't think at minus 190 is the value side, just because if Pena does put together a good fight, if he is improving from fight to fight and he does stay on the outside, then Drakkar Klose is going to have problems himself. So I think from a betting line perspective, the value is still on Luis Pena, but I do think Drakkar Klose is going to win. I'm picking Drakkar Klose to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Eddie Wineland versus John Castaneda. John Castaneda is currently the minus 130 favourite. The comeback on Wineland at plus 110 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, right now at minus 130, I do think that Castaneda is the value side. If that line widens though, and we start seeing minus 140, minus 150, then we'll see plus 115 on Eddie Wineland, maybe even plus 120 at that point. I do think that the value would drop off there. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week though, the current trend is the money coming in on Castaneda, and I do agree with it, but again, I only think it can go so far before money starts coming back in on Wineland. He is a veteran and he does have a solid path to victory in this fight as well. So when these two step into the cage on Saturday night, I think the betting lines aren't going to be too far off from where they're sitting right about now. But as for how this fight plays out, with John Castaneda, is a real interesting fighter because you look at his UFC debut, he took it on short notice against Nathaniel Wood, who's a solid fighter, and it was always going to be a really tough fight for Castaneda to win, a really big ask, a really big mountain for him to climb. But it's the way he fought in that fight that actually really impressed me. He was firing a lot of volume out there at Wood. He didn't back down from Wood. He was getting in the face of Wood. He was being the aggressor in that fight, and it was really impressive to see. But what really makes me have questions on that performance is when you look back at Castaneda's previous fights, Castaneda wasn't that type of fighter. He does have moments where he takes a bit of time off. He does have moments where he comes forward and he can be countered quite easily. He does have moments where he really struggles to pull the trigger on his strikes. So when you watch his fights outside of the UFC and then you watch his fight against Nathaniel Wood, it almost makes you question what Castaneda we're going to see. If this is a new Castaneda, a developed Castaneda, Castaneda that we saw against Wood, then he's going to go out here and absolutely smoke Eddie Wineland. But if it's not, and it was just a one-off career best performance, then I do think that Eddie Wineland's going to come into this fight and knock him out. And that's Wineland's path to victory. Wineland, he is a fighter I've definitely got question marks on his durability, especially after that Sean O'Malley fight. And even in the Grigory Popov fight, he was hurt a couple of times as well. So I do think that Castaneda could potentially get to him, but I don't think Castaneda's got huge fight-ending power, so it could potentially be an accumulation of volume that puts Wineland out if Castaneda wins by knockout. But Wineland has got good movement on the feet. He's really unorthodox. He puts power in his punches. He's got good combinations. He's got a good low kick as well, and he really mixes things up well with his hands, and that's what concerns me from Castaneda's perspective, because I have seen fights where Castaneda does get hit a little bit too much. Nathaniel Wood landed 131 strikes against him to the 55 of Castaneda, so that is a concern for sure. And it's also the reason I do think that Wineland is going to have some good moments in this fight. But if Wineland doesn't hurt Castaneda or knock him out, then I think it's going to be very difficult for him to win, because Castaneda is going to be the more active fighter. I do think he is going to land a little bit more volume. I do think he's going to not back down from Wineland, which is important. I think he'll be able to push Wineland back in moments. And I do, again, like I've already said, have question marks with Wineland's durability. Even though Castaneda doesn't appear to hit super hard, that accumulation of volume could definitely wear on Wineland and put him out. And although I don't put too much stock into the fact that Sean O'Malley knocked Wineland out, because O'Malley had an incredible stylistic matchup there, I mentioned that when I broke that fight down, but it's the way that O'Malley knocked him out, how bad that knockout was. We don't know what sort of long-term effects that may or may not have had on Eddie Wineland. Ultimately, that's a huge red flag. I think that Castaneda is definitely a good enough fighter at this moment to beat an aging Eddie Wineland. I think he's got a couple of paths to victory too, with his striking and also his wrestling as well, which doesn't look too bad. So I'm picking John Castaneda to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Julian Erosa versus Nate Landwehr. Rosa is the slight -115 favourite. The comeback on Landwehr at -105 as the slight underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, it is a borderline pick'em, and I feel it's one of those fights that could be close. So if you've got a good read on either side, then it is actually playable on either side, as long as I've said, you do have that good read. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I don't think it's going to move too much, and it hasn't moved too much for quite a while as well. I honestly can't remember the last time I saw the betting line move. It's been close for a while, not much money seems to be coming in on either side, and when these two step in the cage on Saturday night, it wouldn't shock me to see at a dead even -110 pick'em on either side. As for how this fight plays out though, I'm a really big fan of Nate Landwehr. He's a really fun fighter, and I think a lot of people would agree. They like to see him fight. He comes forward, hands down, looks to get in a brawl, loves to get cut up, loves to cut up his opponent. You look at the Darren Elkins fight and it was just an absolute war, but ultimately it's that Elkins fight that makes me really hesitant picking Nate Landwehr here, to the point where I'm not going to be picking him to win this fight. Even though I'm not massively high on Julian Erosa, I definitely think Erosa can be got at, but Erosa's a dog fighter as well, and I don't think that Nate Landwehr has the type of power to put Erosa out, and the type of power other fighters that have put him out have had, such as your Devontae Smith. It's that type of power that's really going to floor Erosa, and Nate Landwehr is more of a zombie, stalking forward, accumulating volume, really trying to break you type of fighter. He will look for takedowns as well, but again, I think Julian Erosa has got decent takedown defense. It's not the best, but it's certainly not the worst. He can get back up to his feet as well. It's not as if Nate Landwehr's got a crushing top heavy BJJ game himself. So I do think this fight's won and lost on the feet, but the problem that I have with Nate Landwehr is he's so hittable. You look at Darren Elkins, who isn't really known for his big volume, and in that fight with Nate Landwehr, he landed so many strikes on him. He actually outlanded Nate Landwehr as well. He landed 121 strikes, which Darren Elkins doesn't put up those types of numbers in his fights. He's only hit north of 100 once, and that was 5 years ago against Chaz Skelly, who is more of a grappler. So to be landed on that many times by Darren Elkins, who isn't that type of fighter, at the tail end of his own career, is very, very alarming. And I actually bet Nate Landwehr in that fight as well. I won the bet, but it was so much closer than I thought it was going to be because he was so hittable. I think Julian Rosa is going to be able to land on Nate Landwehr for sure. I don't think Nate Landwehr is going to be able to break him, which that's where Landwehr really thrives, when he can break his opponents inside the cage. I think Rosa's an all-round type of fighter. He's good enough in every single area to be okay here. I don't think he's going to get knocked out. I think he's going to outland Landwehr, and I think he's going to win the fight. So I'm picking Julian Rosa to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Shayna Dobson versus the newcomer, Casey O'Neill. Casey O'Neill's currently the -145 favourite. The comeback on Dobson at +125 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the value sits with Casey O'Neill. She looks like a really interesting fighter that I think is actually going to do quite well in the UFC. I'm still not so high on Dobson, even though she beat Agapova as, I think, the biggest underdog that we've ever seen win inside the UFC. So yeah, I do think the value side is Casey O'Neill in this fight. As for where the betting line moves, it's actually really interesting because Casey O'Neill opened north of -200, but all that money came in on Dobson and the line has closed up quite a bit. And I do agree with that line movement. I think north of -200, Casey O'Neill was way too wide in that spot. But as it sits right now, I do think it's going to fluctuate throughout fight week. I think we'll see bits of money coming in on O'Neill, bits of money coming back in on Dobson. Ultimately, when they get into the cage on Saturday night, I don't think the betting lines are going to be too far off from where they're sitting right about now. And as for how the fight plays out, I do feel it's a striker versus grappler matchup. Shayna Dobson, in my opinion, does have the better boxing, the better hands, and overall the better striking. And it's a bit of a surprise really, because Casey O'Neill has trained for years out at Tiger Muay Thai, worked a lot with the likes of Loma Lookboonmee, so you would expect her striking to look a little better and a little sharper than it actually does. But her grappling is really good. She's got an ability to take her opponent down, more of a BJJ takedown than wrestling takedowns, but she's able to get her fights down to the mat, and when she starts grappling, she flows really well on top. She reminds me a lot of Joe Solecki and the way he gets his fighters down and the way he controls his fighters and the way he looks for submissions and just the way he transitions from position to position. I do see some similarities in both Casey O'Neill's grappling and Solecki's grappling for sure, but the winner of this fight is going to be determined by who gets their game plan going, where this fight takes place. I think that although I've said Dobson's striking and her boxing is better than O'Neill's, O'Neill really likes to come forward aggressively and wing strikes. I think Dobson's a better boxer and a better striker when she's on the front foot opposed to being on the back foot. I'm not saying that Dobson on the back foot is going to get into a whole host of problems with the forward pressure and the striking of O'Neill, but I do think that she is more suited to fighting on the front foot, which should allow Casey O'Neill to come forwards, close the distance, get a hold of Dobson. Casey O'Neill in an interview has said that she expects the majority of this fight to stay standing and stay in the striking realm. If that's the case, then I do actually think she loses this fight, but I also think that's mind games at the same time as well. Looking at the tape on Casey O'Neill, I just don't think that she's going to be able to come into this fight and just not grapple. I think that would be an awful decision to make, to the point where I don't think she makes it. So I do think the fight will get down to the mat. I do think Casey O'Neill's going to have a lot of success once that starts happening. I think she's a far better grappler than Dobson. If she doesn't get Dobson out of there with a submission, then I do think she can ride out on top and in good positions to win minutes of the rounds and then ultimately win at least 2 out of 3 rounds. So I do think that Casey O'Neill is the better fighter. I think the biggest gap in skill is on the mat. I think even though Dobson's the better striker, Casey O'Neill isn't a terrible striker. For those reasons, I'm picking Casey O'Neill to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Chaz Skelly versus Jamal Emmers. Jamal Emmers is currently the -240 favourite. The comeback on Skelly at +200 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think that the odds are lined quite fairly here. I understand why Jamal Emmers is a -240 favourite, but at the same time, I don't see a huge ton of value in -240 for Jamal Emmers at the same time. And on the flip side, I wouldn't say that Chaz Skelly is the value side at +200 either. I think as I've already mentioned, the betting lines are lined very fairly. It's quite accurate, so I don't see too much value on either side. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, again, I think we're going to see fluctuation. I do think we'll see Emmers up at -260, -270, but at that point, Skelly would be +225, +230, so I think we'd start seeing money come back in on the underdog in Skelly. Ultimately, when these two step in the cage on Saturday night, I think their odds are going to be very similar to where they're sitting right about now. As for how the fight plays out though, I think it's a good fight for Jamal Emmers, and one of the reasons stylistically I think that it definitely favours him is because how Skelly wins fights is he needs to close the distance, his wrestling's good, he can score takedowns, and his jiu-jitsu's even better. But the thing is with Jamal Emmers, he also has a wrestling background. Both offensively and defensively, he's going to be there in this fight. It's not going to be easy for Skelly to take him down, although I think Skelly will take him down early in the fight. Again, I think it's not going to be too easy. I think Skelly's going to expend a lot of energy, a lot of cardio trying to take Jamal Emmers down, and that's ultimately one of the biggest problems that we've seen with Skelly over the years, is that cardio just tends to drain quite quickly. But on the flip side to that, even when he's absolutely shattered, if he gets a takedown and starts grappling, it's almost like he's not even tired anymore, and that's just the signs of a true BJJ player, a true grappler, someone that is tired, but as soon as they hit the mat, they don't look tired anymore because they're in their world, they're in their realm, and they can get to work. The thing is, it's going to take a takedown to get Jamal Emmers down to the mat for that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to start kicking in for Skelly if he does get tired down the stretch, and I'm not sure if he's going to have the energy later in the fight to be able to score that takedown, to level that playing field on the mat, if that makes sense. And I think in regards to the striking, Jamal Emmers is a much better striker. He's not an elite striker or anything, but I do think he's the better striker in this fight. That is going to matter because the moments where this does play out on the feet, especially if Emmers can defend the takedowns from Skelly, it's going to force Skelly to strike, it's going to tire Skelly out. Jamal Emmers has no cardio issues. From what I've seen, his striking looks relatively solid, his wrestling looks relatively solid, so I think that Jamal Emmers stylistically is in a good fight in this spot. I do think the majority of this fight does take place on the feet. I think the fight's won and lost on the feet, and for that reason I'm picking Jamal Emmers to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got the return of Zahabi fighting the newcomer Draco Rodriguez. Rodriguez is currently the -170 favourite. The comeback on Zahabi at +150 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think there's marginal value on Draco Rodriguez at -170. It does seem like the money is coming in on Zahabi closing this betting line, so the more money that comes in on Zahabi, the more value there'll be on Rodriguez's betting line, in my opinion. As for where this betting line moves throughout fight week though, as I've just mentioned, the current trend is the money coming in on Zahabi. Zahabi has that name value. He's also fighting a debutant as well. People will see that plus money and instantly just like Zahabi as a bet, as an underdog. So I think that money will continue to come in on Zahabi. I think it will close this betting line, and I don't think we'll see a pick'em, but I do think we'll see Zahabi at +125, maybe +130 come fight night on Saturday night. But as for how this fight plays out, from an Zahabi perspective, I'm just not impressed with him at all. He came into the UFC with a lot of hype around him. That's purely because of his surname, Zahabi. His brother is Firas Zahabi, who owns TriStar Gym. They produced fighters like George St. Pierre and plenty of other world-class fighters that have competed inside the UFC. So when Firas Zahabi's brother came into the UFC, everyone got super excited, and unfortunately he was a bit underwhelming. He did win his debut against Reginaldo Vieira, but it was a fight that was very, very close, and I also believe it was a fight that the UFC put together to make Zahabi look really good and to really push that hype on him, and it just didn't materialise like that. In regards to his style though, he does have a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, which is good, but he doesn't really use that grappling topside because his wrestling isn't that great, and he doesn't really shoot for many takedowns either. He's more of a striker that starts off well in fights, that gets his movement going in and out of range, landing strikes. But the thing is with Zahabi is he gets hit more than he lands, and once he starts getting hit, he starts to become a little hesitant. He can be got at from a counter-attacking perspective, and once you get him moving backwards, his activity and his volume just slows down so much that it's almost impossible for him to really put a stamp on his fight. And again, with somebody like Draco Rodriguez, who has got a professional boxing record, record. I think it is only 2-0, but having boxing bouts does show me that there's a level of confidence in his hands. He can kick as well. He'll kick on the outside at the legs. And in regards to his grappling, he's a really good grappler. He doesn't tend to use his offensive wrestling too much, but Rodriguez gets shot on so much by opponents. If you look back at his previous fights, pretty much everybody that fights Draco Rodriguez tries to take him down, to the point where I actually started feeling quite sorry for him. But his grappling has gotten so good over the years for that reason, because he's had to the point where he's good in a scramble. He can reverse a position, he can get on top. Once he's on top, he can find good positions himself, gets off ground and pound, looks for submissions. Draco Rodriguez is a really good fighter, and although I feel that this is his UFC debut, so we might not see the best version of Draco Rodriguez, it's still probably going to be enough to beat somebody like Zahabi, who, in my opinion, isn't a UFC caliber fighter. The level of competition that he's fought outside of the UFC has been quite weak as well, and at 33 years old, I just don't see him making the type of improvements that you'd expect out of somebody like Draco Rodriguez, who's only 24 years old. I think it's a tough fight for Zahabi. I do think that he's probably going to get his walking papers after this fight if he does lose, but I think Draco Rodriguez is a good fighter, young, developing, and even if he has some UFC debut jitters in this spot, I do think he's good enough to beat Zahabi, so I'm picking Draco Rodriguez to win this fight. And in the next fight, it's another rebooked fight from a previous card. We've got Sergey Spivak versus the newcomer Jared Vanderaa. Spivak is currently the -240 favourite. The comeback on Vanderaa at +200 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, Jared Vanderaa at +200 I think is the value side. I said the same thing on the last breakdown when I broke this fight down. I believe that Vanderaa was +195 there, so not too far off here, but yeah, I think that Vanderaa at +200, the line's too wide, and he is that value side. And as for where the betting line moves, I actually think more money's going to come in on the favourite in Spivak here. I think when people look at Spivak's last fight against Carlos Felipe, they're going to see that as a really good win against a fighter that you could argue is better than Jared Vanderaa. But even if that is the case, MMA math just doesn't play out like that. Regardless though, I do think that people will rather bet on Sergey Spivak at -240 than Jared Vanderaa at +200. So I think once these fighters step in the cage on Saturday night, we're going to see Spivak maybe -250, -260. But as for how this fight plays out, I think Spivak showed a lot of improvements and developments in that fight in regards to his striking against Carlos Felipe, who's a good striker himself. People really associated Spivak with striking not so good, but if he can get a takedown and get on top, that's where he's going to thrive. But actually his striking looked really good against Carlos Felipe, and I think that's one of the reasons that has made him quite a big favourite in this fight. I think in regards to his speed, he's slightly lighter in weight than Vanderaa, so he should have that speed advantage in regards to the strikes, but I think that Vanderaa is a more efficient striker. He's a fighter that is more aggressive, he's big, he's strong, he likes to come forward, and he will throw in combinations as well. He won't output a ton of volume, but he will put together solid combinations that do have the likelihood of hurting his opponents and looking good in the judge's eyes, you know, looking like he's trying to finish the fight. I don't think the wrestling and grappling is going to play too much of a factor in this fight. I think Spivak is probably the better grappler, but I think the defensive wrestling of Vanderaa is probably good enough to keep this fight standing. Obviously, one mistake, one poor piece of movement, one foot out of place can lead to getting taken down, but for the most part, I don't think it's going to be enough to make this fight won and lost on the mat. I do think it's going to be won and lost on the feet. I think Spivak is going to have the slight edge in volume here, but I think Vanderaa is going to have the bigger action moments, the better moments on the feet, with the punches that are looking like they're landing heavier, which I think will favour the judges should it go there. But obviously the heavier punches have a higher likelihood of finishing the fight, so because of that, I do feel that Vanderaa is more live for a finish. I think he could look better on the scorecards with the big punches as well, so I'm picking Jared Vanderaa to win this fight. And in the next fight, in the final breakdown of this episode, we've got my favourite fight on the entire card between two newcomers. We've got Rafael Alves versus Pat Sabatini. Alves is currently the -190 favourite. The comeback on Sabatini at +165 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the value sits with the underdog in Sabatini at +165. I understand why Alves is the favourite for sure, but at +165 I think the line's simply too wide. And as for where this betting line moves throughout throughout fight week, I think we're going to see Sabatini money coming in. And I think once that money does come in, it might push Sabatini to plus 130, plus 135. And at that point, the line will probably fluctuate between the two fighters. We'll likely see Alves money coming in. And then in response, we'll see Sabatini money coming back in. Ultimately, when these two step into the cage on Saturday night, I do expect Rafael Alves to be around minus 175 with Sabatini at around plus 140. But as for how this fight plays out, it's going to be such a good fight. I think it's going to be fast paced. I think it's going to be fireworks. You've got Alves on one side, who is a very exciting and explosive striker. He's got good Muay Thai. He will be a little patient at times, but that tends to come with the territory of being a good Muay Thai fighter. They tend to be a little bit more patient, but when he comes forward, he really explodes and he really bursts forwards. He's definitely got power in his hands. He loves to throw big hooks, and if one lands on the chin, then it's definitely going to hurt his opponent at the very least. And as for his kicks, he's got a really nice kicking game as well, and he really likes to throw out this real unorthodox switch kick, which he'll throw up as a front kick and then he'll switch it to like a hook axe type of kick. It's really unorthodox. It doesn't come with too much power, but it's definitely fun to see. And one word that I've just used there is actually one of my real concerns for Rafael Alves though, and that's the word fun. He is really fun to watch. He's very explosive. He's short, but he's stocky, so he has a lot of muscle mass, and he over exerts in pretty much every single fight. He'll come forward, he'll look to be aggressive, explosive, land big shots, and I wouldn't say he has terrible cardio, but he certainly slows down the longer the fight goes on, to the point where his activity drops off quite a lot as well. And that's where somebody like Pat Sabatini is going to really capitalise on in this fight, because Sabatini's striking isn't outstanding. I do think that Alves is probably the better striker, but the thing is with Sabatini is he doesn't overly strike in his fights. He wants to close the distance. He wants to use his wrestling background, shooting on takedowns, get his opponents down to the mat. And that's where I really think that he's going to wear on Alves, because early in this fight, I think Alves is going to have moments for sure, dangerous moments. But once those moments start to become overly dangerous, I think Sabatini is going to shoot takedowns, or at least just clinch up with Alves. And he might not be stronger than Alves in that first round. But once Alves does wear down a little bit, he does start getting tired, I do think that the strength will go down with that as well, and Pat Sabatini at that point will be able to have moments in the clinch, in the aspects of the physicality, and I do think he'll be able to score takedowns on Alves. He's still got to be absolutely careful that he doesn't put his neck into that guillotine, because Alves will absolutely rip it off and submit him. But I do think that the way Sabatini pressures his opponents with his wrestling and becomes relentless and just makes his opponents work is going to be a key factor in this fight, because the last type of fighter Alves needs to fight against is a fighter that's going to drain his cardio and make him work a lot and make him work hard, and that's what Pat Sabatini will do. I think Sabatini will end up falling behind a little bit early on in this fight, but the longer the fight goes on, the better he'll look, the more he'll score the takedowns, the more top control he'll have, the more static that Alves will be, not only on the feet but on his back if he's taken down as well. So I think Sabatini, the longer this fight goes on, just weather that early storm, if there is an early storm, which I assume there will be, I think he'll be fine the longer the fight goes on, and I like Sabatini for that reason, so I'm picking Pat Sabatini to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of On the Moneyline. I hope you all enjoyed it, and once again guys, I'd appreciate all the likes to the video and subscriptions to our MMAPlay365 YouTube channel too. Remember, you can get all the betting advice you'll ever need over at MMAPlay365.com. We cater for long-term gamblers that like to build their own bets and strategies, gamblers that just want to follow exactly what I bet on, and as a long-term winning gambler over the last 4 years, that will likely come good for you. And we also cater for you fun gamblers that like the long shot fun parlays, or ACCAs as we call them in the UK. Even if you only want our best value underdog for the event, which is free by the way, we have plenty of different packages and subscription options for you guys to choose from, and they're all at very affordable prices too. Just hop onto MMAPlay365.com and see what's best for you. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you at the next event.